Klaus-Dieter, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you guys do at Betelligent?
Yeah, Klaus-Dieter, I'm having a economic background. I started in Cologne 30 years ago and working all my life for different consulting companies, and data analytics was my first topic with the first company, and it's still my favorite topic. So 3.5 years ago, I decided to join Betelligent, one of the top 5 specialists in the German-speaking countries on data analytics. We're about 400 experts only concentrating on data analytics, and we do a holistic approach. So from data strategy, from the design, the infrastructure, up to the operations of data platform, we do everything. Pretty good brand in the German market, and the company is owned and led by the 2 founders. When I joined 3.5 years ago, they were looking for someone as a managing director, joining them here for the organization. And so I'm responsible for sales, for portfolio development, for some of our competent areas. And that's the reason why we work together with AWS.
Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to getting your insights. And Jason, obviously you need no introduction, but for those who are new to the show, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so Jason Young, based out in London. I work at Amazon Web Services as a lead data strategist. So my role is really, to help companies across Europe, Middle East, and also Africa is to become more data driven, really thinking about a data strategy, but also navigating, how you can align people's mindset and people, and also the process, which is important in Europe, particularly around, as you mentioned, all the different regulations, the decentralization that we're seeing right now within this region. How do we kind of navigate that to still get business value, but also keeping the tradition of what, people want to live and breathe in Europe?
Sure. So, we've shot other episodes where we talked about UK and US and how it's different navigating different challenges there. With you representing the UK and our colleague Kendra representing the US, now we have an EU view as well. How do you see these 3 different markets play out, and what's common and what's different about them when we're talking about the data strategy space?
Yeah, if you distill down to the different regions, there's actually a lot of commonality in terms of what the key use cases are, the key business objectives. If you were a manufacturing conglomerate based out of the United States and one in Europe, the fundamentals in terms of what you need to get as success is not different. But it's actually the different nuances as you really drill down to the use case and how you enable the capabilities and also the people. It's actually quite different. One thing is that, the speed in which innovation occurs in the United States with, the amount of net new migration with new sponsored work visas means that it is easier to find new talent to be able to innovate quickly. Whereas in Europe, we're finding that, the people have their domain expertise. They want to be able to skill up. So you can't just hire in people to be able to solve for the problems. So I think with those innate, challenges, even in terms of the types of people that solve for the problems, there's very different execution pathways. And I think, Klaus, you would have seen that with Betelligent is that how you actually solve for the use case, how you stand up the projects for European clients versus for if you were working with a client in the United States is very different.
So, Klaus, what's your view on that? What's unique about, a data strategy rollout in the EU, for example, or in Europe?
I would agree to Jason. I think there's a difference, and you can see it for the last 20 or 30 years in the software market. So there's a broader software market in the US, and maybe 50% of the vendors really make it, or 60 to 70 make it to the UK, and only 50% make it to Europe. Because in terms of innovation and really changing systems, maybe Europe is a little bit more conservative. I normally compare it with house building. You build wooden houses in the US, and if they break down because of a storm or something like that, you build a new one. It's pretty normal. Especially in Germany, where I come from, you always build houses out of stone and for the next 100 years. And sometimes I have the feeling that it's comparable when with building software systems. So we normally have a longer time period in mind, and that makes us a little bit slower because we have to think about it, and we have the engineering way of doing it. It's special in Germany, but you see it in other European countries as well. So I think that's one of the challenges why innovation might be a little bit quicker in the US compared to the Europe.
So it seems like stone is more reliable than wood, but a wooden house gets built faster. So there seems to be a trade-off here between reliability, excellence, insisting on high standards at the cost of speed. How does that translate to organizational change management as it relates to data strategy in European organizations, you think?
From our point of view, change management is really the biggest challenge at the moment. And you see it with different customers. Could be customers that are quite new in the data analytics market. So we still see a lot of companies, especially in the bigger mid-sized companies with a low maturity in the data analytics area, but especially with companies that already are in the market for the last 20 or 30 years. So insurance companies, banking, retail, telco, they have a certain model in mind. They are still on the, we need a centralized data warehouse approach. And if you want to have a more business-oriented view, if you have a more decentralized view on data analytics, like you have it with data mesh, it's not a problem with the data or the technology or the methodology that you can use. It really is a change in mind and getting the business more involved, getting this change in mind that you not need a centralized approach for everything. And so we just made a few projects around change management, and yeah, it's quite a thing to get people to do something different.
So if I am a consulting company, or I am a new CDO to an organization that's like this, how do you address these challenges, and how do you get people on board for the change that needs to happen?
I think one of the key factors is maybe changing the wording. So a lot of consulting companies, including ourselves, we tend to, I normally say we use this data plus X wording. We use data mesh, data culture, data literacy, everything with data. But for a lot of, especially business people, data is a little bit abstract. So you have to change the wording is what is the benefit out of it? If you do a lot of data governance, it seems that people always have the impression, oh, it's a lot of work. But at the end of the day, it makes you more efficient, more sustainable. So the business value is quite obvious, but it's still hard to explain. And so I think changing some of the wordings and going more in business terms might make it easier to drive this change, because you can reach other people in the organization, you can reach the C-level. If they see the benefit, then it's easier that they follow the change.
So it's almost like literacy for data literacy.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, you need to connect the world of data to the world of business, basically. See how this isn't some extra task we need to do, something that we need to build into our operations to achieve our business goals better. Kind of like how if we take somebody who's not very tech savvy, and we know that tech is a tool, it's a solution for their problem, and they just think, oh, I'm not good with computers, or I'm not good with tech, or I'm not good with phones. And then you frame it to them as, actually, this will help you deliver your food faster, or this will help you get the help that you need, let's say, or it will help you book a flight or a hotel faster, or get to customer service quicker. It's that kind of translation that needs to happen on the organizational level, yes?
Yeah, to give an easy example, if we work in projects with customers on data governance topics, and you go to a business guy and say, hey, can't you be the data owner, the data steward? He said, okay, all new role, and maybe it's combined with work. So they refuse to be the responsibility guy for being a data owner or a data steward. But if you ask them, are you responsible for KPI 1, 2, 3, or 4? Are you the guy who's defining it? they normally say, yeah, that's my responsibility to find is the KPI. And I said, okay, and that makes you then you are the data owner or the data steward, whatever the role is. So only if you change the question, you get a different answer. And then I think another point is that you have to make a difference between providing data and using data. So if you see the market and you see the discussions in the market, there's a lot of focus on providing data. So we are delivering data to an end user. But then the value story starts, because finding the right data to work with, understanding the data, collaborating on the data, deciding on it, and then the action out of it, that's the value part. And in a lot of projects, there's not enough focus on this type part of the data value chain. It's often about, okay, we have a data platform and we bring all the data together. And only if these two components work perfectly together, then you get the added value. So the basis, the data platform must be there and must be good, flexible, scalable, and so on. But at the end of the day, you have to organize the process of using the data as well. And that's the reason why business people say, okay, it's a problem of the IT, because they think of the providing the data and not using the data. Maybe that's a difference. So if you make this, we often work on this two parts, and then you get the business better involved.
Often, sometimes this is a chicken or an egg issue, right? The data platform is not quite there, but also we're still working on making that change management and connecting the owners of the KPI to the future data project that would actually give them the result that they're looking for. On the ground, how do we square that circle, Jason? How do you put a roadmap for some of the organizations that you've worked with in the EU to connect both of these worlds together if they're always in progress?
Yeah. I think the reality is that, the EU has a really good framework in mind in terms of what good looks like. And I think, in the spirit of having that framework, there is arguably a lot of regulations, a lot of governance in place to actually say this is the KPIs that organizations need to look for. And we're seeing that right now with the new EU AI Act, is that these are the set of guidelines that you need to adhere to. I think the problem is that becomes quite a defensive strategy for organizations to take on, because they take that regulation and they see it for what it is, and then they build their strategy against that framework. But the reality is that framework should be a set of guidelines, but it shouldn't be used as a defensive strategy. Organizations need to actually then think around, and actually, where does the proactive strategy then sit? How do you then enable your organization to see the benefits of the framework? And I think that's been something that has been almost a maturity curve in itself. Whenever there's a regulation that comes through historically in Europe, such as GDPR, PSD2, the PSR regulations for financial services, Europe has always been at the forefront of the framework. But it takes a while for then organizations to see the benefit. And I think on the ground, we're seeing that organizations, particularly some of the smaller organizations, what we call kind of the small, medium enterprises, anywhere between 1 to 5 billion in revenue, either in euros or in sterling. These are the companies that actually are a little bit more innovative. They see the regulation for what it is, and then they look at, how do I incentivize the people that have an organization to have a more positive set of metrics, rather than metrics like KPI 1, 2, and 3 that are more defensive? What about then owning KPI 4, 5, and 6 then enables you to actually drive that true business value? I think that's something which, from my experience working at banking, that has been a much harder curve, because compliance has always been an area that is almost like an afterthought. But when something comes down in compliance, there's a big fine that's levied in European government. So that's why organizations are actually defensive. But what we need to see is actually, what's the positive side of things? And that education really needs to be both from a technology side and a business side. And I think the role of what we're seeing right now of the chief data officer to try and do all of that, I think that's too much. So what we're actually seeing is that the chief data officer role in the last few years, we've hired all these chief data officers in Europe. We're starting to see that individual roles within the CDO has been now being dispersed into technology business leaders as well. So that way, it's not just the CDO that has to do everything. I think that's also quite important, because the average tenure of a chief data officer has actually been decreasing in the last few years. It's not because they want to move to another job, but sometimes when they enter into that organization, the change in the mindset is so hard, seeing everything that's happening from the regulation and also seeing the change in like the organization being so slow that they can't make meaningful change. So they end up leaving. So what we're seeing on the ground is actually the smart CDOs that's going in. They're not saying, I'm going to change everything myself. They're finding people to support them. Really good anecdote I always talk about is like the bulldozer versus the bus driver. I think 5 years ago, during the pandemic, everyone was, I wanted to be the bulldozer. Like I will do it single-handedly to drive value. But now with everything that's happening with AI, it can't be a single person dependency. You need to really see how you can incentivize people. But I think incentivizing them means that you need to know those people. You can't just say, I think you can do this, go do it. Like you can't enforce a top-down level conviction. And again, like the anecdote I always say is like top-down conviction, but also equals like bottom-up enablement. You need to have the gap between top-down and bottom-up closed sufficiently for success to happen. I think organizations are closing the gap right now.
So you mentioned this term defensive strategy a lot. Can you expand on that and what should organizations do instead, or what should they do in tandem with defensive strategies?
Yeah, so let's use the example of the AI Act. So the AI Act that was instigated on the back end of last year in 2024 was a set of guidelines that organizations need to look at their AI workloads, and then they would then score based on if it's a high risk or low risk. And if it's high risk, you shouldn't do it. If it's low risk, then you need to think about these certain considerations. And if you get it wrong, you'll be fined, right? So the threat is a fine. Now we're seeing that, with large organizations, particularly in the United States, some large organizations have been levied fines from the European government. Now, in a way, that then disincentivizes that firm to operate in Europe. Because if all you do, no matter what you do in innovation, you're going to be penalized, that then moves away that investment into Europe. And I think what organizations need to see is don't think of that as a defensive strategy. Don't then stimulate the flow of innovation. How do you ensure that areas like legal compliance are part of the mix when you're doing something? So I think what we're seeing right now is that when you try and solve problems, bring those areas, bring the regulators in from the very beginning when you are starting to do something. Now, that's quite hard as an organization that wants to innovate because obviously there needs to be an ownership of intellectual property. You might be quite defensive. You don't want to share your ideas to the regulator. But I think in this current environment where data is so federated, you have no choice. And I think the smart organizations are doing that from the very beginning. They're getting that buy-in from the regulator at the top, as well as your own legal and compliance audit functions, making sure that you're on the right path. And then, we love to, talk about in Amazon is like think big, but also start small. So if you think big and you've got this big game plan on what you want to do with AI, that's fine. Tell everyone what you think big is, but then you make sure as you iterate on your AI workloads, you start small. And then every time you start small, don't just do them as proof of concepts internally. Make sure that you have the voice of the end regulator as well as your end customers to be able to get that feedback. And I think organizations probably have been a little bit slow in AI to do that. 2 years ago, when generative AI became a really big thing, a lot of these proof of concepts were done internally. They weren't sharing that feedback. They were just trying to start things out. But there's actually really strong evidence right now to show that there's a lot of proof of concepts that don't even make it to production. And that's actually going up and up every single year. And there are actually some organizations that are even ditching their production AI workloads because they can't see the value, that return on investment, but also they're quite defensive as well. So I think there's a bit of an organizational mindset that needs to change, but it also needs to be an element of the regulators, really being transparent on what organizations are doing. If regulators don't know what's happening, of course, they're going to be more defensive as well. And I think, in a bubble, everyone is going to be defensive. So we need to start to collaborate better. And unfortunately, Europe is one of those areas where we're seeing historically, because regulation is like a de facto stance for, the EU and also for federal government, it becomes something that is harder to change compared to maybe other regions in the world.
Yeah. So, Katie, do you see that is an opportunity uniquely in Europe for innovation in terms of building processes to manage regulation and not slow things down? So, for example, do you see a lot more streamlined processes when it comes to data protection, data anonymization or tokenization, maybe the use of clean rooms, so that whatever project that a cross-border European organization starts, they've already got these data sharing mechanisms in place beyond somewhere else where everything is kind of internal and they don't really need to bother with setting up those that extra data protection infrastructure.
As long as you work within the European Union, it's pretty easy. Every time if you work with the UK or sometimes work with, if you have offshore centers in India, it's getting more complicated. But I think that most of the companies are already used to all the regulations. The only problem is a little bit too much at the moment. So there are some regulations on the supply chain transparency. You have the ESG reporting. You have the GDPR. You have the EU Act. So sometimes it's not that easy to keep the overview about the different regulations. But I think it's not the biggest innovation challenge that we have. So a lot of companies are really working on new use cases, on new ideas, especially driven by all the Gen AI movement started 12, 18 months ago. So we see a lot of new AI waves coming. So we had it 5 or 7 years ago. There was the first AI wave with a little bit of disillusionment because a lot of things went into production. So it's getting better now. So we see better solutions. But one of the challenges is people still think in projects. And I think that's the thing I like about this think big, start small. If you go into data analytics, if you want to be and I normally say not data-driven company, but a business-driven company, and it's data-enabled, but it's a program. You don't start a project, you start a program. And that's the way you should think about it. Because I see a lot of short-term projects, quite successful, but keeping the quality, the efficiency over time is really a challenge. You need a good data platform. You need that's flexible, scalable, adaptable. You need the data governance around it, and then you can make the next 10 use cases. You need the right basis, and sometimes people forget about it. They only had the project focus and said, okay, I don't need the money for the data governance. I don't need the money for the right basic solutions. Let's make this use case, this use case, and then let's see what's next. And then they figure out they're missing out something on really scaling it up. And I think changing this perspective on you are starting a program that never ends.
Yeah.
And in terms of you have to manage it, but you get value out of it over time. It's not one hit wonder. You make one use case or 3 use cases, then you have some added value. It's a continuous enablement of your business. And we could get this idea a little bit more onto a C level that really it supports over time the business development. That would be helpful.
Do you often see across the continent that the CDO role has, first of all, prominence across these organizations? Does everybody have a CDO? And if they're there, are they empowered enough to make the changes that are required?
I don't think so. And if you see, if I take it from a German perspective, I think for 5 years ago, there were a lot of new CDOs. I think the number of CDOs is going down again. So maybe, again, we come to this data plus X. Maybe it's not the CDO as the right role. The question is, what is the right role for this enablement with data? Sometimes it was more I need a CDO to cover all these regulations, and they didn't have the innovation in mind. We see a few organizations that are different. So normally they have a very good digitalization strategy, and then they have more strategic affairs really in going into that data analytics topic, but because then they know this is a part of driving their digitalization. Where the mobility provider really with some very innovative solution, very business case driven. I work a lot of with the data or the head of data analytics, and we have some calls from time to time to see what they're doing. Very interesting customer, but they do it with a digitalization strategy as the basis. And I think if you have this in mind, then you can have a efficient and effective CDO role. Otherwise, it's okay, we needed one and maybe he can cover the regulations, but they are not enough in the innovation part. And that would be something where I would see the need for a change maybe in this role.
Okay, so this is sort of like if you want to build AI use cases successfully, how do you see the chief data officer role evolving, especially in the EU? What's the right profile mix and task mix, I guess, that they should retain in their function versus pushing it out? Because I'm seeing here that they need technical skills, of course. They also need business skills. They also need organizational, navigational skills to align the stakeholders. But in the EU, it seems like they would also need to be almost a liaison with the regulator as well. So what do you see in terms of evolution of the role?
Yeah, I think like every industry fundamentally needs to, understand, who the people are that they fundamentally work for, which is the citizens, right? And I think the good chief data officer would to have a direct line to the government or the regulator and actually just having, really good conversations. We're seeing that permeate right now in social media, one of the most popular kind of professional social media sites, LinkedIn. You see a lot of chief data officers actually going to the government, actually talking to them and actually, posting that they're having that discussion with the minister of, digital. But I think it's important because it's about knowledge sharing about what private and public can actually do. That's also really important as well. The profile of a chief data officer in public sector will be quite different to private, but actually it's one and the same. They're still solving the same problem. I think the problem is that they don't talk to each other, these different sides of the coin. And I think it's a good profile to be able to collaborate on the public and the private sector. I think that'd be good, but also evangelizing to different people and different teams on successes as well. So it's not about talking about your technology and your skills or talking about use cases. Sometimes even like this forum that we're talking about here, I think organizations could do better to do more of these type of roundtables and actually, showing people who don't even use data, like this is what we're doing. This is what we celebrate as success. I think once you celebrate success and it's a positive thing, you're starting to build out this community of enablement as well as community of success. Because once you tell someone something is good, people want to gravitate towards learning a little bit more about it. I think organizations are sometimes building things in silos and not telling others in different areas of the business, hey, we've done this. They're not telling, recognition. They're not doing enough around that. And I think if a chief data officer could really provide the ability to broadcast success internally and externally, and if that was their only role, I actually think that would be a lot more advantageous than them trying to build out use cases or saying this is the priority X, Y, and Z. Because I think if a chief data officer didn't prioritize it, someone else is going to. I think that's a really big thing. AI is moving at such a fast speed. Next week, there's going to be a new foundation model. Next week, there's going to be a new way of putting in agentic AI or putting in RAG. So what's the point in trying to prioritize for the next 6 months? Because it's going to continue to move around. Chief data officer should probably use their soft skills, their personal skills to try and encapsulate the organization on what it means to be data-driven. And if you can build out that practice, then I think that's hopefully going to be something that they can then step away from and then realize, hey, I've left a mark. I think that's really important because people think about things in projects, right? So they think about, I've finished this project, I can then step away. That's the wrong mindset to be project-driven. You need to leave a legacy behind. Organizations in Europe have like 3 or 4 times the time span of other organizations around the world. In fact, I read that, one of the world's oldest organizations is based in Italy. It lasted for like 1,500 years. You've got all this history in this organization. So short-term gain is not going to mean anything for organizations that's lasted back in the Stone Age to some extent. So we need to make sure that these leaders can really leave that legacy behind. Once they've seen the success, recognize the success, and then they leave so that others going to pick up after them.
So if I could add something to that, because I think it's interesting, because if you take the role at the CDO and you put it in a little bit more detail, I would see, carry from what you said, you see different focus points. What is, you need some kind of data platform like you need an ERP system in your, and there shouldn't be any discussion about it, that you need it. It must be maintained and developed as professional as you do it with your ERP system, because it's a crucial part in your organization to really drive your business. And then, yeah, maybe the regulatory part might be another focus point within the organization of a CDO. And I think one important point is the continuous development. So we normally take customers in a journey on, okay, let's do a data strategy, and then we start some kind of activities with them. But the data strategy never ends, because the AI market is changing, the native data is changing. So it really is a continuous process. So I think one of the core responsibilities of the CDO is really having a look on what might be the strategic support out of data for the business strategy. And this is a continuous process. It's not a data strategy. It's again, not a project. It's really a continuous task you have to do. And then you drive the value over time. So there is a basis, and you organize it professionally so that it can react to different use cases, and you scan the market for data. There are new data platforms that provide new data. You can think about new sensors in your production to get new data out of the machines, everything. But normally, customers today don't do it systematically or strategically to really improve on the basis of data what they want to do. They get some ideas on a use case on the basis of AI, or they had the need for some new reports, but it's a continuous process. And as you just said, as the change in the market is so quick, that's some of the responsibilities of the CDO. So you have the platform, you have this continuous strategy based on data, and maybe this regulatory part, but which for different industries, it's different importance. So if you see, for example, the banking area, their problem in innovation often is driven by the fact that their resources are that much occupied by the regulatory tasks they have to do. They don't want to invest more in being innovative, even though they need it. So that really might be another responsibility within the CDO organization to really have a holistic view, or not only one path. Only try to know what is your point.
Excellent. How do you see them moving from the project thinking to the program thinking, from AI use case to AI factory?
It's challenging. So if you take the customers that are already on the market for a longer period, they normally have more a program than a project thinking, and they have less discussions about costs. So if you have an insurance company, we just had an insurance request for proposal last year. They said, okay, we have a 30 years history. We were working with SAS. We have more than 300,000 SAS data sets. We have more than 10,000 reports, and we came to the conclusion that we cannot migrate it. We want to do a greenfield approach, and our first project step will be a data product map, and we will do it for the next 3 years. In parallel, we will build the basic platform, and with a few lighthouse projects to prove that this platform will work. And then we will continue this work for the next years to complete it, and then it will go into production. So there's a 5 to 7 years time frame in mind. And there one with layered external support, but there's no real discussion about the business case. If you take these mid-sized companies you mentioned before, with low maturity, they are starting their first projects. They are really very, very they have a narrow thinking on what is the business case. They don't. It's hard for them to get this continuous view or program view, and if so, it differs from industry to industry and what experience customers have with data. The more experience with data, the more they already have this program thinking.
So that's interesting. Would you say, Jason, then that one of the roles of the CDO is to elevate the discussion into building a system or framework for managing data and AI projects rather than just showing business a shiny AI POC, which could be part of the reason that a lot of Gen AI POCs are not moving into production?
Yeah, I think it's really, building sustainable momentum, even if they're not around anymore. Yeah, I mentioned before that the tenure of a chief data officer is reducing. So to incentivize chief data officer, you shouldn't be kind of telling them that you need to stay the entire program, which might take, 5-6 years, right? So I think it's about how do they build out a framework and a mechanism where they can continually scan the environment on what you need to do now, as well as what the trends are in the future. How do you incentivize the people who produce data and consume data to be part of that community? And then making sure that your framework will have ways in which you can delegate responsibility so that when the chief data steps off and then someone else comes in, they can pick up after that. And almost like, you imagine this as being a tangible document, right? This is technically a process document that you would have someone read, but you would have that done in a very platform-centric kind of vision where there's an application that actually maps out all of those stage gates to be able to take that feedback. So actually a data platform to actually look at your data strategy is something that we're seeing chief data officers do, is like you actually look at your internal metadata, what people are doing, what is the advantages of things, what you're doing in terms of your operational workflows, and they're using that to be able to generate use cases. And then you then have a separate data platform that will actually do the work to actually then push that use case out. So I think chief data officers need to be very introspective, very retrospective. They need to be humble as well, I think, to be able to say, I don't know what I don't know. So I'm not going to build out a proof of concept and hope that people will buy into it. I need to be humble, understand what people want and need. And I think that really dovetails in terms of what we're seeing a lot of organizations, particularly Amazon Web Services and also Be Intelligent, helping out customers on, is by being able to have a program of work where we can really, what we call, work backwards against what the needs and wants are of the organization. And then we can devise that framework. And I think sometimes it's hard for a chief data officer to be humble, to have someone externally like us to tell them, hey, you need to do this, this, and this. But I think there's a reason why these programs exist, is because chief data officers, they did realize arguably the mess that they jumped into. And now they realize it's too hard a jump for them. So we need to start to help them out. We need to enable them to be a forcing function, to bring all these different areas together and then leave lasting peace, so to speak, for them to be able to carry on.
Yeah. Katie, I think a lot of organizations would need, hopefully they'll benefit from this talk, but they might need some hands-on support and guidance on the strategy level and then translating that into execution on the ground. Where can our listeners go if they'd like more help on these topics?
We are working on data strategy services for the last 12 to 24 months to really develop them, to adapt to the new requirements we see in the market, to the change in the market. So we try to help our customers on the potential side to really find the right potential. You cannot do it on a high level, data driven is good or data is good. You have to do it on a department level, on a process level, and really be specific on what is the added value that you deliver. And on the other hand, on what can you do to be more professional, more sustainable with your platform? What is the right platform? What are the right components? How do you how can you get more flexible and agile? What's the importance of data governance? Because it makes a difference between being successful in a project and being successful in a program. Normally, you have cycles of 3 to 5 years, and then you can re-engineer a data platform. Yeah, it's good for our consulting business, but it's not good for our customers. So we try to convince them to the data governance and metadata management, and really supporting them to have a sustainable platform, a flexible platform to adapt to this continuous change in business needs and business demands. That's our quite interesting discussions with our customers.
So I think based on everything both of you said, we need to think big, and we need to connect the data to the actual specific business value of the different parts of the organization. And we need to identify the owners of the KPIs that would translate into data projects. And then we need to start small with those data projects, but connect them to an overall program so that the success of the project means the start of the program, not just the start of another project. And when we're building those projects out, we don't just make it a POC or an MVP of success of the project or the technology, but also embedding the regulation successfully into our organizational operations so that serves as a blueprint for the flywheel of the program that will drive all of the projects forward until eventually the North Star would be that slowly, not in a day and not in a big bang approach, it becomes part of the business's DNA, where we don't really have any particular silver bullet. It's a program. It requires discipline and execution and gradual buy-in from the different stakeholders.
Yeah, that's you just mentioned it, and then we really picked it up from the workshops we made together on data strategy. We picked up this flywheel idea and already worked with it with some customers. This really works out pretty good. On really, yes, if you think in this picture of flywheel, it really was an effect we had in workshop with customers to think in that way. So as you just mentioned it, I remember that we tried it in with a few customers, and it was very helpful.
Jason, any last thoughts for a new CDO who is facing a big transformation and a lot of regulation, and a organization that is thinking in a more siloed way? What are the top 3 things that they should do in their first 6 months there, since their tenure isn't that long anyway?
Yeah, so I think like the key recommendations I would make with, any executive leader, has some responsibility with data is that as you come into that organization, like I said, be humble. We really ask the right questions in terms of what the business wants in terms of their business strategy. And then even before you start to devise what the data use cases are, spend the time to actually really know who they are as a person, how long they've been in the business, and also like their needs and wants as well. The only way that you can really endure sustainable change is to be able to really win those audiences. I think that would be step 1. I think step 2 is as you map out those KPIs, as I mentioned, think about KPIs and flip them around to be less about defensive KPIs and more for reporting sake or whatever, more about what's the other side of it. It's like, if you get that KPI right, then what does that enable in terms of another KPI? So how do KPIs actually work in conjunction with each other? From a data point of view, that's actually quite easy to look at cause and effect, but no one's actually really looked at that level of KPI as a data point and how they interact. They only think about data points like the customer data points and what they're using with like your products and services. So chief data officer really needs to look at that internal data and then treat that almost as a data platform. A really good way in which Amazon.com has scaled is that the people experience team or the PXT team deliberately look at that internal data to enable all the people who work in Amazon to be at their best selves. We always talk about only hiring bar raisers, but we can't hire bar raisers unless we're able to help them to be bar raisers themselves. And the only way that you can do that is looking at your internal data and then seeing how you incentivize them and enable them. We talked a lot about enablement. Different people will have different maturity levels on what they want to enable on. So chief data officer really needs to be that. And if they don't think that their role is to be that kind of HR type person, I dare say that's not the type of role that organizations need right now, because you need to really enable long-term gains for the company as well as the people who work for the company. So that's step 2. I think step 3 is that you mentioned about bringing in people from the different regulations and so on. Just make sure you talk to those places early enough. And as you build, the actual use cases, the minimum viable products, make sure that you are right sizing the team that builds them. Have small decentralized teams that can build them, but you don't need to pick the best 6 to 8 people to solve for them. Sometimes a chief data officer is choosing to be daring, to find 4 people who are really good at what they do and 4 people who like to do things, but they're not skilled at. If you can incentivize those 4 people to do that work, even if it takes twice as long, and if you get the results and you celebrate that success, those 4 people who are skeptical about that data journey suddenly become evangelists. And those are the people who then talk to another 4 people. I think that's really important is that, building this community needs those evangelists, but those evangelists can't be the top leaders. It needs to be those people who do the work. If you only give the cool stuff to the data scientists, to the AI engineers, they're going to do that work and then they're going to move on. And you're going to leave behind the people who have been in that company for 10, 20 to 30 years. So how do you incentivize those people to be part of that journey? Well, you need to bring them in to actually do the work, even if it takes twice as long. And I think sometimes as a business, organizations always think about the fastest way to get things done because they think about project-based, tasks. So rather than think about projects, think about short-term pain, long-term gain. I always talk about Star Trek references, but, the needs of the many fundamentally in data have to outweigh the needs of the few, right? Particularly in this environment where AI, where things continually change. Those will be my recommendations.
So I think basically it would come down to, it's not a company that achieves business results. It's the people in the company that achieve the business results. So building the program also involves building out the community.
Exactly.
Really appreciate your insights, Jason. Always a pleasure, always learning from you. So thanks for coming again, Katie. This has been really insightful. Thank you for giving us that lens of the EU landscape and what's happening there. And hopefully our listeners will be able to benefit and scale out data strategy across Europe. So thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to stop.